Yeah, format-wise, our talks will be about 35 minutes, should leave us 15 minutes for Q&A. We'll pause for a break between each of about 10 minutes. Chris is first up, then Alexandra Diclo, and then Robbie Williams is third in our set today, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, do you want to try that sharing just now, Chris? See if you're...
Yeah, let's see if I can do this. So
see if you've got the power.
I hope I do. This looks like the one I want. So did that pop up?
Looks like it. I can see a Word doc.
Yeah, I'm just going to do the Word doc. That'll work. That way, if I find any typos, I can correct them in real time. That'll be very exciting for the audience at home. So I apologize that this is more of an ethics talk than a metaphysics talk, but it's kind of what I was independently thinking about based on some experiences I had playing VR video games and then reflecting on kind of frustration I was feeling at various places. And I will get to that near the end of the talk. But so it's kind of a cheeky title. Let's see, it gets qualified in a bunch of ways. I'm going to assume, for purposes of this talk, I think I believe this anyway, but I'm going to assume it will follow that there are virtual objects. So that's a contentious bit of metaphysics. And then we can have object-directed attitudes towards them and propositional attitudes directed towards propositions in which they're constituents. Whether abandoning this assumption would substantively matter with respect to the axiological judgments discussed below, I think is actually an open question and maybe something we might want to talk about during the Q&A. But for now, I'm just going to help myself to the metaphysics of virtual objects and then see whether or not there are interesting evaluative implications doing so. All right, and what follows, I'm going to be focusing on that kind of value that goes by a lot of names in the axiology literature. I prefer well-being. Sometimes you hear the name personal value. Sometimes people characterize this not in terms of a property, but in terms of being good for, so kind of a relational kind of conception of this feature, broadly speaking. And I'm going to be very lazy in what follows. So good is just going to be shorthand for intrinsically good, and the kind of goodness in question is well-being goodness, personal goodness. Similarly for bad, better, or worse. So if there are places where it's confusing to do that, I will just explicitly remind the listener that that's what I'm talking about. Now, there are lots of non-intrinsic kinds of goodness and badness. Follows. So I'm just going to mention them now, and then much later in the talk, I will flag them when. The one bad thing about having the word there is it's like telling me I'm spelling a word wrong. Maybe I am. I'm actually a little bit dyslexic, so I'm always nervous about this. But there are kinds of non-intrinsic goodness that we used to have in mind: causal and constitutive goodness and badness. So something is causally extrinsically good or non-instrumentally good. Instrumentally good or bad, if and only if it is a cause of something intrinsically good or bad. And something is constitutively extrinsically good or bad if it's an essential constituent of something that's intrinsically good or bad. And it's going to turn out that for the most part, the thing that I'm worried about when I wonder whether or not virtual objects can be bad for us is whether they have this kind of constitutive extrinsic badness. More on that in a bit. All right, so I want to ease my way into the ideas by reminding us of some kind of stock examples in the axiology lit. So a particular version of the experience machine example, and then what's intended to be a more realistic but substantively eliciting the same axiological judgments kind of example, and that's the deceived businessman example. All right, so the kind of experience machine case I want us to imagine is one in which the person is in it from birth to death. The person is not aware that he or she is in the experience machine. The person does experience lots of different feelings, emotions, has beliefs and desires. And I'm going to stipulate, even though I think this is a bit contentious, if we recall the old Putnam stuff from the, I guess it was the 70s and 80s about brains in the vat, I'm going to stipulate that the kinds of beliefs and desires that a person's experience machine has are the same as the kinds of beliefs and desires that a person outside of the experience machine can have. All right, so there could be someone in the experience machine that believes that they're standing in front of a computer, giving a Zoom talk to a bunch of audiences, etc., wearing a Notre Dame hat, that kind of thing. And that's the same sort of belief and desires that a person outside the experience machine can believe in too. All right, so a number of people, when they think about this sort of case, come to judgments about it. Now, I'm going to set aside the people who think that a life in the experience machine, as I've described it, is just as good as the qualitatively indistinguishable life outside of the experience machine. I know that there are people in the axiology literature, prominently some defenders of very simple forms of hedonism, that will just say that's just as good. And if we're talking about well-being, maybe not just as good if we're talking about other kinds of value, but if we're talking about well-being, it's just as good. So I'm going to set that aside, and I'm going to consider two sorts of judgments one might have when one has rejected, perhaps on the basis of thinking about the experience machine. Two sorts of judgments one might make about how well off the people in the machine versus people outside the machine are. So the first kind of judgment is the more conservative judgment, just that a life in the experience machine is less good than qualitatively indistinguishable life outside of the experience machine. So this judgment just says that guy is qualitatively just like me, thinks he's giving a Notre Dame, wearing a Notre Dame hat, talking about stuff on Zoom. His life is less good than mine, even though it's qualitatively indistinguishable. From the inside, it doesn't feel any different. So that's a more conservative judgment than the second sort of judgment one might make, which is that a typical life in the experience machine is a bad life. So I'm thinking of the kind of case I described as what would be the typical life, from birth to death, whole time in there in the machine, not knowing it. The judgment in EM2 is that that's a bad life. All right. The deceived businessman case, like I said, is often introduced as a less fanciful way of eliciting or making the same sort of argument using the experience machine, an argument against mental state theories such as a simple version of hedonism. So the deceived businessman case, typically stated, goes like this. There's a dude, he's a businessman, he's deceived, that's what the name suggests already. What's he deceived about? Well, he thinks his boss respects him and his coworkers like him. He thinks that his romantic partner is faithful to him. He thinks that his children love him, and all that stuff's false. Partner can't stand him. Colleagues thinks he's an idiot. Boss keeps him around just because he is like the butt of jokes they make behind his back. And the kids just quietly, like, they find him cringe to the extreme, to use the terminology my kids use. He's maximally cringe. All right, so the deceived businessman, everything feels really good to him because he's got all these false beliefs. He's really happy. Now we're going to contrast the deceived businessman case with a case in which someone has the same beliefs, is pleased in the same things, has the same sort of desires, but just he gets lucky. He happens to be right, has a faithful partner, has a boss that respects him, etc. And again, we can elicit similar judgments. The life of the deceived businessman is less good than a qualitatively indistinguishable but veridical life. The life of the deceived business man is a bad life. Well, let's take advantage of this ability. Watch that. Wow. All right, that's real-time philosophy. The life of the deceived businessman is a bad life. Now, like I said, this case is often introduced after people for the experience machine case, and then roll their eyes a bit about crazy philosophers and their crazy thought experiments. What's the relevance of this distant possible world, etc. Whereas the deceived businessman is something that could and probably has happened. That kind of case probably has happened in real life. Okay. They're often treated as serving the same sort of axiologically equivalent function. But on the view that I will defend in a little bit, it's going to turn out that the life in the experience machine is a worse life than the life of the deceived businessman. So there's going to be an important difference between these that I'm going to try to tease out in a little bit. I see some people chatting. Should I be looking at these or?
Well, I was just tossing up whether to interrupt you there, Chris. Your sound keeps coming in and out a bit, and I think it correlates with when you're moving the Word doc, which is something I think I've seen before. So it might be that takes up a lot of, so your bandwidth sounds better now, but it seems like when you move that, it takes up bandwidth and then it seems to erode your audio.
So I should pause after each time I push the down button.
I don't think it's quite as clear cut as that, but that might help. But the other thing is maybe turn your video off, given that we're mostly looking at the thing. It might be wise to do that. That might do that. Any other wise suggestions, by the way, please dive in. But that's something I've come across before when people were when stuff was moving on screen. It creates a
did that
bandwidth
help
issue.
to turn the video off? You're muted now, so you can't.
Maybe we'll let's see it over the next couple of minutes. It can just about make you out anyway, but it's better to improve it if we can. So
sounds good. And honestly, no one needs to look at me anyway. They're not missing much, so it's all fine. Although I do feel like I should change my profile picture to the Notre Dame hat to make sure I'm getting paid for this. Okay. So like I said, I don't know if this came through or not, but the case of the deceived businessman is often introduced as a much less fanciful way of making the same sort of argument that is made using the experience machine and argument against mental state theories, such as that simple version of hedonism that I alluded to earlier. But it's going to turn out that on the view that I like, the experience machine is a lot worse. Okay, so let's pause for a second. Okay, did that help to pause after I scrolled down? Who knows? Okay, well, that's the downside about Zoom, and I'll try to speak a little slower too, because that might help too, to make sure there's no garbling. All right, so suppose you share these intuitions. Maybe you believe E1, EM1, and DM1s. You have the more conservative judgments, just that one life is less good than the other. Or maybe you think the less conservative thing, that the lives are positively bad, in which case you accept EM2 and DM2. What explains that fact? Not the simple version of hedonism that's refuted by these judgments. So we might look at other purported explanations. So one purported explanation that's popular in the literature is a kind of desire satisfaction explanation, that what is good for one is getting what one intrinsically wants. And a satisfied true desire is good to proportionate to how strong it is, and a frustrated false desire is bad proportionate to how strong it is. And the nice thing about this explanation is it does license, at the very least, your DM1 and EM1 judgments, since in both cases, the person is not getting what he or she wants. The person in the experience machine has a number of frustrated desires that are not frustrated in the veridical life, the correlated veridical life. Now, if their frustrated desires are particularly strong, stronger than any of the satisfied desires, that would also license EM2 or DM2. The life would end up being a bad life because the amount of desire frustration would be greater in extent than the amount of desire satisfactionism. I don't really like desire satisfactionism. I dislike it so much that I'm not even sure how to spell it. But my fundamental objection to desire satisfactionistic explanations of the sort is that the view that it's based on is false, that getting what you want, intrinsically want, isn't good for you when you want something not worth wanting. So I'm not going to try to defend this. This is the kind of gut level view. But we could take that idea into account and formulate a version of desire satisfactionism that respects this thought. And it could still explain EM1, EM2, DM1, and DM2. So we could introduce a kind of modified desire satisfactionism, where still it's the case that what is good for one is getting what one intrinsically wants, but we modify how good a satisfied desire is by saying that the goodness of a satisfied desire is a function both of how strong it is and how worthy of wanting the object of that desire is. And similarly, the badness of a frustrated or false desire is determined by how strong it is and how worthy of wanting the object. And on the assumption that the person in the experience machine or the deceived business person do have desires for things that are worthy of having, that are worthy of being desired, then we'll still get that the two lives are less good. And if they're really worthy of being desired and the desires are very strong, we should be able to yield the judgments that the lives in question are positively bad. So this is I think, a more satisfactory version of desire satisfactionism. It takes into account the idea that some things are more worth wanting than others. That's not the only kind of explanation. So another kind of explanation is an objective list explanation, according to which pleasures and pains are good and bad, but they aren't the only things that are intrinsically good or bad. True and false beliefs are also good and bad. But again, it's hard to believe, though, that every true belief is equally good for a person. So if I have a lot of true beliefs, right now I believe that I'm on a Zoom conference I also believe that my computer is stacked on top of a bunch of stuff and that my dog is snoring in the next room. There's some grass outside, and it's hard to come up with the thought that that's all as important as, say, some belief about the origin of the universe or whether there's a God or not. A more plausible theory will introduce an idea like significance or worthiness of being believed into the theory as well. And I think this idea is actually already implicit in the theory, since truths are more fitting to be believed than falsehoods. So we already have in this theory this idea of worthiness of being believed. We're just going to generalize it a bit more and not only look at the truth value of the content of the belief, but the content of the belief in more depth and have a kind of graded conception of worthiness. So that's another option. Now, if you have this view, you could make sense of how it is that the DM1 and EM1 judgments are true. What's different in the case is that there's some false beliefs, and those false beliefs are bad for the person in question. They decrease the value of that person's life, and that's why the person who lacks those false beliefs is doing better. If the false beliefs are significant enough, they're really important, that might even be sufficient to drop that person down into the negative land, having a bad life, and that would be your DM2 and your EM2. It would depend on how we formulate the objective list and come up with the various ways of weighing these different items on the list with one another. Now, a third kind of explanation is a complicated hedonistic explanation, according to which pleasure and pain are more fundamentally propositional attitudes. And the goodness or badness of a pleasure or pain is not simply a function of its intensity, but also of its veracity. So if we think that fundamentally, when we're talking about pleasure, we're thinking about things like, I am pleased that something is the case, versus it feels good. And when we're thinking about pain, fundamentally, we are displeased that something is the case, as opposed to it feels bad. So if I'm meeting with a bunch of my students and I'm reading their work in advance, and I think it's really good, like they've done a really good job, this is a high quality dissertation chapter or whatnot, I will be pleased that they have done such good work, but that might not be correlated with any sort of bodily sensation. It's just a propositional attitude of being glad that something is the case. All right. Now, the idea seems to be then that true propositions are more worthy of being the objects of pleasure than false ones. So instead of having a simple version of hedonism, we could have a more complicated version, according to which pleasures and pains are propositional attitudes. And the value of a pleasure or a pain is not simply the function of its intensity, but also whether it's true or not. But as before, it seems, though, that even among truths, some are more worthy of having pleasure taken in them than other truths, and an even more adequate version of hedonism would account for this fact. Now, if we have these sort of views in mind, this is again common to the axiology literature, we're going to need to think about whether or not the kind of view we want to develop is one that's going to involve negative valuations versus discount rates. So we could, for example, we want to take just the simple view that's just thinking about veracity of pleasure and pains. We could have the view that all pleasures are still intrinsically good, but every true pleasure is more valuable than any false pleasure. All right, so that would involve a kind of discount rating or a kind of upper bound to how good a false pleasure could be. Or we could say that two pleasures taken in the same object one of them is better than the other when it's in a world in which the pleasure is in a true object than when it's in a false object. Maybe it's twice as good or something. A more strict version or a more extreme version would say that false pleasures are actually bad for you. And it's not simply that they're less good than they would have been were they true, but they're bad to have. And which one of these views we would take will make an effect on whether or not we're going to be able to support the more strict judgments about the experience machine and the deceived business person case. We need negative valuations to get the deceived business person or the experience machine person to end up having bad lives on this sort of view. So these are all plausible explanations. They all license the judgments that at least I think seem plausible about the two cases. I think they're all on the right track rather than competition with one another, but I think they're each individually incomplete. So far this has all been stage setting. Now I'm going to start wheeling out the view that I find more attractive. I think they're also jointly incomplete. There are other attitudes that do not reduce to belief, desire, or pleasure, but whether they hit fitting targets is also directly relevant to how good or bad life is. So, consider, for example, love, and what to say about the difference between the experience machine and the deceived businessman case. So in both cases, there are objects of love. So the experience machine person is in love, let's say, but what she's in love with is a virtual object. Whereas the deceived businessman is also in love with his partner, who's not a virtual object. We can imagine that even though in both cases there are objects of love, the loved objects, the people, are at least worthy of being loved in the deceived businessman case. Right, so there's nothing in the case, that I stated in which, the romantic partner is not worthy of being loved. There's lots of reasons why romantic relationships, lose their strength, lose their intensity, cease to be, that don't involve the person becoming positively unworthy of being loved. And so let's just stipulate that this partner of the businessman is still worthy of being loved. She's a real person, or he's a real person. Maybe even a morally decent person, not like a Hitler wannabe or whatnot. Whereas a virtual object, I think, is not worthy of being loved in the same way. And this is one reason that the experience machine life is worse than the life of the deceived businessman. This is a way, I think, that's not captured simply by saying that there's more false beliefs or false pleasures or frustrated desires or whatnot, because this object-directed attitude of love is not one that reduces to those. So we might have already thought, for example, that the life in the experience machine is a life with more false beliefs. But still, this is a further reason to think that the experience machine life is a worse life than the life of the deceived businessman. Similarly for frustrated desires, false pleasures, and so on. So the general view that I'm advocating for, which would certainly require much more careful formulation than I'm giving here, is this. Every attitude that can be assessed as fitting or failing to fit its object is something that is good or bad, and its value is a function not merely of how intense that attitude is, but also of how well it fits the object. All right, so this is a very inchoate statement of the view that I'm trying to develop and motivate, at least initially here. I'm going to try to apply it to the virtual object stuff in a few minutes, but you can already kind of see where I'm going with this, I think. What we should want, potentially speaking on this view, is a well-fitting life in which your attitudes fit the objects that they're directed towards, whether those objects are genuine objects like people in the case of love, or propositions or states of affairs in the case of propositional pleasure or desire or whatnot. And one reason why I think we want this more general view is that we might have similar judgments about comparative value of lives that don't involve cases that seem to reduce directly to pleasure or pain, beliefs, etc. So let's consider another kind of experience machine case, but this case involving anger rather than pleasure. So I want you to imagine you're in the experience machine. You don't know you're in the experience machine. You think you're being abused by somebody. It's just a virtual object, but you think this person is tormenting you, humiliating you, betraying you at every stage. And you are really, really mad. You are really angry. You are angry at this virtual object that you believe is responsible for your misfortune. So consider a case like that, and consider a parallel actual case in which the angry individual was in fact wronged by another person. So a veridical case. So my judgment in this case is that the anger in the first case is worse for the angry person than the anger in the second case. The first person is having a worse overall experience, not because it feels worse, but because the anger is directed to something that's not the fitting object of anger. The virtual object is not the cause of this person's misfortune. Maybe the program or the experience machine is, but not the virtual object to which the anger is directed. Whereas in the veridical case, the anger is directed at the person that in fact wronged you. And so it's just a more fitting object in that case. Now, part of what I think is motivating this intuition is that what seems worse about the non-veridical experience machine case is that there's something even extra pointless about the anger. It's just a waste of this misfiring emotion. There's something, like I said, pointless, or maybe we should use the term meaninglessness. So two things I'm unsure about when I'm thinking about this view is whether intuitions about meaninglessness are playing a role here. I kind of feel like that might be going on in the case of my intuition involving anger, but I also suspect something like that might be going on just when thinking about these two lives in the experience machine and the life of the deceived business person. There's something not merely sucky about them in the sense of they're making mistakes, but it renders their life less meaningful than it would be. And so the second thing I'm unsure about that's related to this first thing is whether what explains why the well-fitting life view is true, or at least seems plausible, is that a well-fitting life is also a meaningful life, and meaningfulness is an explanatorily deeper value property than well-being. So I don't know about that. This is stuff I'm thinking about. This is all kind of inchoate in my head, and I would welcome thoughts and suggestions. All right, so that's the view that strikes me as nicely captures all that were partially right about the previous attempts to explain the differences in value between the lives of the veridical life and the experience machine life on one hand, and the deceived life and the veridical life on the other hand. In each case, we're appealing to attitudes that do not well fit their object. And the natural generalization of what's right about each of those views is the view that any failure of fit is bad in the sense of hurting your well-being. All right, but I think this view does have some worrisome applications. So I'm gonna talk about one that's a little bit personal for a second. What kind of got me thinking about this, in addition to having to have something to present here, is that so there's this video game, this VR game that I spent way too much time playing. It's not Elven Assassin. I spent too much time playing that one, but it's a different shooting game. It's called, I think, In Death Unchained. It's like a one-person shooting game. Still run around with arrows. You still shoot things, etc. And there was just this one boss that I could not beat. Just kept kicking my ass every time I got to him, and I kept getting so pissed off, so angry. And what I was angry at was not simply the situation, that it was frustrating to not make it to the next level, but I found myself being angry at Asmodeus, the level boss that I couldn't beat. The virtual object became the focus of my anger. And on the view that I'm considering, I made my life worse by having this feeling that didn't fit its target. That's somewhat worrisome. I think this is an actual case in which virtual objects can be bad for people. This Asmodeus was constitutively bad. He was an essential constituent of my object-directed anger, and that's unfortunate for me. Then I started thinking more about this sort of case, and I thought, well, what's happening when Asmodeus throws a rock at me? I'm actually moving my physical body. I move to the left or I move to the right, and it happens pretty quickly. And as it happens, I have a kind of startle reflex, which suggests that at some level I was afraid of Asmodeus physically damaging me. And again, Asmodeus can't do that. The wall that I moved into to get out of the way of Asmodeus, that actually hurt quite a lot. That did physically damage me, but I wasn't afraid of that. I was afraid of the virtual object. And again, by the lights of the view that I'm considering, this was a state of affairs in which my life was made worse. Not made worse simply by the fact that it hurt when I hit the wall, but the very fact that I had a fear that was not fitting its object. That I moved also suggests to me that maybe I believed something was coming at me, at least at some level. And I think that's a hard question. So we're into the kind of A-leaf, B-leaf territory, and I don't really know what to say about that, but it might be that I even have a kind of implicit belief that's false, that's not fitting my object. And so that would be another respect in which this situation was intrinsically bad for me. Now, I don't love Asmodeus, so now we're going to get a little bit more fanciful, but the kind of thing that I am a little bit worried about when I think about the development of virtual reality technology is that I already know that there are people, because there are like Netflix documentaries about them, that fall in love with like fake things like mannequins or sex dolls or whatnot, things that are not the appropriate objects to be in love with. And so I'm worried that because virtual reality is already so immersive, it's already making me run into a wall to get out of the way of a cartoon looking demon. Or another game that I like to play actually is the boxing game, Thrill the Fight. And the first time I played that, even though they look super cartoony, my heart was racing. I was really nervous. The guys were really big. When they closed in on me, I kind of you can't see what I'm doing, but I'm stepping back and throwing up my guard. You know, this instinctive, it's the immersiveness of it makes it a lot easier to have object-directed attitudes towards objects. And so what do we need to get someone to fall in love? Really sophisticated chat bots implemented with like a really attractive looking avatar in virtual space. I think that will happen, that some people actually will fall in love with objects that are not fit objects for them to love. And that would be very bad for them in this case. So that's why I say this is kind of worrisome application of this view to actual virtual objects and actual virtual realities, and its implications for those like me who do enjoy their time in virtual worlds. Okay, I only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to discuss like two kind of objections to the sort of view that I'm discussing, and then I'll shut up for a minute or so. The first objection I'm going to call the pet rock objection. So lots of kids when they're young and their parents don't want them to have pets do this thing where they kind of make up a fake pet. So they get like a pet rock. Maybe they paint it, put a face on it. Maybe they just kind of carry it around with them without painting it. They talk about it and they say things like, "Oh, I love you, Mr. Rocky," etc. And I think in some cases it's not purely play. In some cases, I think they do have a kind of affection that is approximate to the kind of affection they would feel for a real pet. That's why it's a suitable substitute. It's an outlet for an emotion that their parents are not allowing to happen because they don't have other things that they could be directing that emotion to. On the view that I've been discussing, this is not a harmless thing. They're loving a rock. And loving a pet rock is, by my lights, loving something that's not worthy of having love put in it. It's just a rock. It's not any better to love a pet rock than it is to love an avatar in VR space. And so the kids are actually taking the hit in terms of their well-being when they do this, if my view is right. But you might think, well, that's crazy. It's perfectly harmless. It's harmless to have a pet rock. That's what we might even say. It's just a harmless fantasy. And on your view, it's not a harmless fantasy, it's a harmful one. So I think in this case, I'm actually willing to bite the bullet and say, yes, loving a pet rock does, in that respect, make their life worse. But we do have this distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic personal values, and it might be that the extrinsic value of having this love is sufficiently high enough that the intrinsically good things that it leads to swamp the intrinsically bad situation in which they love the pet rock. Maybe they're a lot happier. Maybe it trains them to be able to love other people more easily. Maybe it makes them more empathetic. Maybe it helps widen their horizons about the wonders of the natural world, in which case they will have other attitudes that do fit their objects that are good for them to have. And this was a useful tool to do so. So it's not that it's harmless, it's just that it's overall, all things considered, a good thing that they have a pet rock. So I'm willing to bite the objection and try to salvage the intuition you might have by doing a sort of standard thing and making this distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic personal values. The second kind of worry that I'm less clear about how to address is the worry that I'm conflating kinds of value. So one thing that I'm really worried about is whether or not this meaningfulness scale and the well-being scale are actually different scales. So if it turns out that they don't correlate with one another, they're just different things we care about. We care about having a good life, but we also care about having a meaningful life. If the suspicion that my intuitions about fit are tracking meaningfulness, and meaningfulness is a separate scale, then I actually don't have a viable theory of well-being. I'm conflating the kind of value that should be kept apart. I'm not sure what to say about that. So that is an objection that I'm worried about. Another kind of objection that I find less pressing, but I want to at least flag as a possibility, is that sometimes we might conflate situations that are intrinsically bad for the world with situations that are intrinsically bad for people in the world. And it might be that failures of fit make the world worse without making anyone's life worse. So in this case, I'm less worried about having that conflation, since the view is motivated by considering individual lives and comparing them against other individual lives, rather than making a kind of global comparison about what sort of world, say, a God should make, if we're trying to think about what kind of possible world God should actualize. I'm from Notre Dame, so I got to mention God at least every talk once to get the full paycheck. So I've fulfilled my contractual obligation, and so maybe I'll just stop there because I think I'm at 35 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kris. Yeah, I'm not sure about my hypothesis for the scrolling or the editing, but it was there and there and thereabouts. So we've got a period of 15 minutes for Q&A just now. If you'd like to ask a question, can you just post in the chat to me privately a Q, and if you've got a follow-up, an F for finger. I'll come to Robbie first for a question.
Hiya, thanks for that, Kris. Yeah, I mean, this is kind of variations of the pet rock objection, I think, but I was a bit worried about kind of sports and hobbies and all sorts of other things that look like they are kind of important to a flourishing life, but their kind of ends look like they're, the ends look kind of absurd if you kind of think about running this distance so fast and stuff like that. And I mean, at least on like Team Youngin's way of kind of describing what goes on when we're kind of playing games like this, you genuinely have kind of preferences, desires to kind of achieve, to get the ball in the net, even though that, I guess, doesn't look like a kind of worthwhile thing to do at all. So I was just wondering, I mean, maybe you could say, well, this is kind of the causal and constitutive kind of value cases. But I was just wondering, in that case, I mean, one of the things that in T's work happens is that he's got this kind of idea of it being a kind of temporary agent of you that has the preference and the kind of desire, and that's kind of subordinated to kind of an overall kind of lingering agent. And, you know, that captures the idea you got to kind of keep it in control, right? You kind of flip into this kind of mode where you kind of intrinsically desire to get the ball in the net. But, you know, if you kind of destroy your personal relationships in order to kind of get the ball in the net, then, you know, maybe you kind of gone out of whack. And so that suggests that maybe, even though these are two different desires of you, it's kind of, you kind of have to deal with the kind of these temporary agencies and the kind of the lingering agency attitudes differently. I don't know how that would fit in, but I just wondered if you thought about those kind of cases.
I mean, it's a view we could consider. I mean, one thing I'd want to know is, if we're really thinking of these temporary agents as agents, do they have good or bad lives? And is that something that we as the super agent should prudentially worry about? Are we letting like our sub-processing take the hit so that the overall value of my life can be better? I'm not really sure what to say about that kind of view. I do want to, like, I guess, be clear about something that, you know, trying to score a goal, I think, is not something that's worth a lot of desire, but that's not the same thing as saying it's like positively undesirable or something that would be bad to want. And so it might be that your life still does go better by virtue of having a pretty strong desire for something that's not super great to desire, as opposed to it being a hurt to you. Whereas I think in the case of love, that's different. So one thing I would want to do, earlier I alluded to this idea of discount rates versus like transvaluation or negatively evaluating what would otherwise be a positive state. And I think there's probably not good reason to think that each attitude has got to be treated the same. So it might be that in the case of desires, you know, unless there are desires for things that are positively unworthy of being desired. So like, you know, wanting to like hurt other people or something of that sort, or debasing desires or something. It might be that their satisfaction is still good for the person. It's just not as good as if they were equally intense but directed to something more worthy. So it's not like the agents are hurting themselves. And it might be that having those sort of desires satisfied is conducive to significant achievements. So achievement is something I didn't mention on the list, but that's another potential explainer. So some people in the axiology literature think that achievements are things that are intrinsically valuable. Oftentimes that's coupled with a view that we got to have a kind of significance rating for achievements too. So like successfully getting dressed is not as significant as an achievement as maybe being the best soccer player on the planet or whatnot. And so if we have this significance scale, which is a lot like the other scales I've been talking about with these other attitudes, it would fit reasonably in kind of view to include achievements, the kind of view that I'm discussing. And it might be that letting my subpersonal agent have some like crappy desires is actually in my best interest, because I'm more likely to have this achievement of high significance, and that's really good for me. So that's if we go beyond desire, it allow like the things that are actually accomplished by having them also to play a role. Then we say, yeah, extrinsically not so great for the subpersonal agent, super intrinsically not so great for the subpersonal agent, super extrinsically great for me.
Cool. Thank you very much. Next question, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Kris. Really interesting talk and view. Just on the application to virtual objects, I wondered how much of this really turns on, virtual objects or VR technology, as opposed to, in particular, to AI technology. Seems to be closer to the heart of the matter. At least what seems to be going on in the key cases involves having attitudes that are appropriate towards, say, conscious beings with minds, when in fact those beings don't have minds. So that might be a non-player character in a video game, which is just a simple algorithm. But the same thing could equally happen with the same technology outside VR, right? I don't know, Alexa or Siri. If I start developing feelings for Alexa, that might seem inappropriate in the same way. I get really angry at my Roomba and so on. I mean, it seems it's not so much the virtuality per se, but the lack of genuine mentality, which maybe correlates with VR in some contexts, like especially video games. But
So I think that's right. I mean, I gave the example of a pet rock, which is about as concrete of an object as you can get. Not a virtual object at all. Like, it's a rock. You don't get more concrete than that. I guess if it was a piece of concrete, you would. But so yeah, no, I think that is exactly right. The reason why the VR stuff seemed especially salient to me is because we are largely visual beings. And one of the things that VR is already quite capable of doing is creating these nice panoramas of kind of a visual feast that triggers our emotions in a way that chatbots might not, or Alexa might not. So it is less of a stretch, I think, to think that someone could fall in love with a virtual object, especially if animated, like I said, by some sophisticated chatbot algorithm, than they would by just the chatbot alone. And so in that respect, they're more dangerous. There's more of a trap for creatures like us that are largely visual creatures. And if you have like a nice voice to go along with it, and a feeling of interaction over time, where it's just me looking at you in the eyes, the virtual object, etc. So it's not that the problem is like essentially special to virtual objects. It's just that given our actual psychological proclivities, I'm more worried about people falling in love with virtual objects than I am with Roombas or Alexa. And like I said, for what it's worth, like there are these documentaries, they're super creepy, of people that have like bought live dolls, that's what they're called, and fallen in love with them. And these things don't even talk. They're things you can touch and look at, but they don't make sounds. So I think if you had a virtual object that you could look at, see, maybe had some sort of stimulation, you would have people falling in love. And by my lights, that'd be very bad for them. So that's the focus, is just because of the kind of creatures I take us to be. Does that make sense?
Sure.
of love or hate or strong emotions towards things that didn't have minds. So I think fictional characters, which is no surprise given what I think the metaphysics of virtual objects are like. But I think it's totally appropriate to feel sad and cry at the end of Toy Story 3. I think you're a bit of a monster if you don't. I think it's perfectly right to love Atticus Finch, right? I think that's the appropriate response. These aren't minded creatures, but it's because you're buying in. I think at the point where you think Atticus Finch is something over and beyond a fictional character, which it seems like is happening to you, when it's Asmodeus, is that some part of you is kind of foxed into not taking this as fictional in the moment that it's happening. And I think that's maybe where the inaptness or the harm can come in, like when we get some problem cases that Netflix is kindly exploiting for our delectation. So I think I want to put that wee thought out there as well.
Yeah, so I think there's a really hard question about what to say about our emotional reactions to fictional objects. And like you, I do like the idea of a virtual object as a kind of fictional. It is a kind of fictional object. It's just one that we see. Unlike, I think even that's kind of tricky. Maybe we don't even see Asmodeus, but we see a representation of him or something. I'm not even certain about that. Maybe it's like seeing Spider-Man, seeing a drawing of him or something. But setting that aside, I'm not sure. I do think it's right to love Atticus. I think it's right to have a love for the kind of qualities that a person like that is depicted as having. It's right to feel a kind of good feeling about the possibility that someone has those qualities, and to try to emulate those qualities, be like a person that has those qualities. But I'm not sure I do think it's true that you should love Atticus, because again, Atticus is not a person. It's just a fictional object. You can pretend to love him, and that might be a different sort of emotional state. And that's different than actually buying in. That's just as you're pretending that Atticus Finch is a real person, you might be having a kind of emotion that you might describe as kind of like pretending to love. And that might be apt. But I'm not sure I want to say that loving Atticus in the way that I love my kids or love my dad or whatnot, is at all appropriate. That seems not right. So I would hold the line.
Okay, I'll fight you later then. I'll go to Ding for the next question, please.
Hi, Christopher. Thank you for this very interesting talk. I have a question about the idea of constitutive good. So when you're saying that being a part of something good makes this thing constitutively good, I think that's perfectly intuitive. But I wonder whether there is a symmetrical relation when it comes to being a part of something bad makes this thing constitutively bad. For example, if we can consider that there is a wheel of a very nice bicycle. I mean, the fact that this wheel is a part of that nice bicycle makes me have a positive attitude, a positive emotional response to that wheel. But consider, for example, uranium is a part of a nuclear bomb. But the simple fact that uranium being a part of a nuclear bomb does not really trigger me that kind of negative, a symmetrical negative emotional response or attitude towards uranium. So I wonder whether this idea of constitutive bad is something that is generally acceptable, widely agreed, or could you please say more about that?
I'm not sure you're even required to have positive or negative valences towards things that are merely extrinsically good or bad. It makes sense to have the judgments that they are extrinsically good or bad. And if we're talking about feelings, maybe it makes sense to feel things like, I guess it's fortunate that there's that wheel in the bicycle because the bicycle's so great. But it also seems to me that there's a sense in which it's unfortunate that there's uranium, because right now we get nuked. Like the threat of nuclear war has never been greater in my lifetime. And so the presence of uranium is like a kind of an unfortunate thing. That seems like an okay judgment to make. And maybe correlated with that judgment is a sense of unease about how accessible the stuff is, the fact that it is parts of nuclear bombs, etc. I'm not sure there actually is an asymmetry when we get clearer on the kinds of emotional valences that would be apt in case when we're just talking about things that are extrinsically good or bad. Does that make sense?
Yes. May I add a very small follow-up question?
Very quickly.
Yes, I think it's just a matter of intuition. Like I feel as if something being constitutively good, we need only like very little evidence. Like this thing simply being a part of that good thing makes it good. But it seems we need like more argument or supportive evidence if we want to say like, look, this thing is constitutively bad. So simply being a part of the bad thing does not really suffice. I mean, that's just a gut feeling. I mean, maybe it's I just have a strange intuition, probably.
Yeah, so
it's very helpful. Yeah.
I guess I'm not too worried about this intuition, because partly because I'm willing to just say, look, this is like just a definition of what I mean by constitutive badness, and not have a lot. I mean, I haven't explicitly stated anything about what sort of attitudes are apt for it. The role it's playing is just having this in hand so we have a sense in which the virtual object is bad. So what's the sense in which Asmodeus is bad? Just in that it's bad for me to have anger directed towards him. But it's not that Asmodeus, here's why I wanted to have this notion of constitutive badness here. It's not that I think Asmodeus is really the cause of the anger. Like, so this might be treading dangerously on more Neil and Dave stuff, but I'm inclined to think that a virtual object and a fictional objects in general are not, strictly speaking, different causes. The causes, of my liking Atticus Finch, for example, wasn't Atticus Finch, is that I read the book. There's the activity of reading that did it. So whatever the cause of me being mad at Asmodeus, it's like, well, there's these lights in front of me, there's this VR headset, like some programmer, all that stuff's the cause stuff. But the object is still Asmodeus. So the object of the anger is not the cause of the anger. So the sense in which Asmodeus is bad for me is not that he's extrinsically bad in the causal sense, but that he is the constitutive of the attitude. He's the thing that the attitude is directed towards. And so, that I add this title, can virtual objects be bad for us? And so I thought it was important to have a sense in which they're bad. And that seems to me like a pretty clear non-causal kind of extrinsic badness. Now, how should you feel about that? Why? I'm not asking you to feel like mad at Asmodeus, because that was the original problem to begin with, or sad that Asmodeus exists or anything like that. I think the relevant thing that you should feel is like, I feel kind of bad for Kris, because Chris's life got a little worse when he got mad at Asmodeus. And it's kind of unfortunate that, Asmodeus exists and Kris is situated like that towards him. I wish one of those two were different. Either, Asmodeus could still hang around, but Kris could have better tempered emotions. Or, if that's not really possible, maybe Kris should stop playing video games. And if everyone was just like Kris, then it would, probably all things considered, be better not to have video games like Asmodeus.
So because you've come across the horrible idea that you were going to stop playing Elven Assassin and beating us all at it, I'm going to have to interject and not let you say any daft things again. I've got one last question I want to get in from Joshua Cohen, please. We are over time, but I'll lead into the break for this one. So if it can be swift, please, Joshua.
Well, thanks. So there's a distinctive kind of badness that you can be tempted to in VR, which is loving things that belong to kinds that are inappropriate objects of love. There's a distinctive kind of badness that you can be tempted to in non-virtual life, which is loving people or hating people or being angry at people who belong to a kind that's worthy of love or hate or anger, but your love or hate or anger is completely inappropriate as directed to the person in question. And that's not a temptation that you can be that you're subject to if it's a virtual person. So people love people who they shouldn't love all the time. So each of these seems like I'll stipulate that the kind of badness that you're talking about is there is something genuinely bad there, but there's also something genuinely bad that happens in interactions with real people. And it's not obvious to me which of those is worse. That is, loving something that belongs to a kind that's unworthy of being, as a kind of being loved, or loving something that belongs to a kind that is an appropriate object of love. But in the instant case,
Yeah,
you're
like Hitler or something.
completely misguided.
Yeah, no, I share that.
Like life sucks, whether it's virtual or non-virtual.
Yeah.
Different kinds of suckiness.
Yeah, so I feel that. And honestly, you know, we can think about Hitler's lover or something. You know, maybe Hitler's going to be our case of somebody not worthy of being loved. And it's not clear to me whether or not that would be worse than loving the chatbot woman or better. I don't have an intuition about that. So when I say there's a kind of distinctive kind of badness,
Yeah.
I don't really mean distinct in the sense like axiologically distinct, but rather there's a new trap for us to take seriously as we navigate the increasing amount of virtual reality in our lives.
Perfect. Good. Okay.